The off season. It means many things to many people, and there's a ton of ways to go about it. No matter what your sport or your primary goal, there's a seasonality to training. High season, low season, the times between. The low season is just as important as the high season. Yet we don't focus on it as much. We don't write articles. We don't do podcasts so much about it. So over the next few weeks, I'll be releasing a series of podcasts discussing what a successful off-season can look like, why you should be intentional with it, and how to organize your training year-round for it. In the spirit of the off-season and getting away from the bike a bit more, I'm calling this series the Off the Bike episodes. So settle back and enjoy. Welcome back, or welcome to the Train Right podcast. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford. As I alluded to in my opening, the next few episodes will be focused on things you can do off the bike in the off season to help bring better results for the upcoming season. Philosophically, I don't really like the term of off season because it insinuates a complete offness when we all know that every season builds on itself. Everything is connected. So what we do in the off season does actually matter. In my opinion, it matters just as much as the in-season. We'll get into more of why that is. Keep in mind, we're also still doing training, some kind of training during this off-season time period. That said, it's a term that a lot of people use across multiple sports. So I'll be using the term off-season in this podcast to refer to this time period in training. The common theme for any off-season is a period of detraining or less training than a period previously to it. So to begin this off-the-bike series of episodes here on the Train Right podcast, I want to start with general education about what detraining is, why it's needed, and give you some real-world tips on how best to implement it into your off-season. So what is detraining? Well, a good definition that I've always kind of applied is it's a loss of performance adaptations which occur by a reduction or cessation of training. And that's coming from Bosque and Mojica's research on the topic of detraining. If you Google, well, I'll include that in on the show notes as well, but there are some preeminent authors on discussing what happens with an athlete who is detraining. But simply put, it's a decrease in volume, intensity, and or frequency, or a combination of everything. To put it even more simply, you could just stop training and you start detraining. So don't overthink it. It's taking a break. However, when we call it detraining and you start to look at the physiological phenomenon that happen, it's pretty interesting. So it should also be noted that detraining can be intentional or unintentional. Meaning, intentional, you plan it into the season. You plan a time period where you don't do training to help recover and do a bunch of other things that we'll discuss. Or sometimes, it happens unintentionally. You get an injury, there's a family issue that may come up, a big life change, that sort of thing, where you just take a chunk of time away from normal training. And so in a well-planned training program, a period of detraining should, in my opinion, exist. It has a duration component to it. It's longer than a recovery week, but it's not so long that adaptation losses become more permanent. And we'll get into what that means a little bit more. So in Bosque's, in Mojica's work, straight and to the point, we're somewhere between 3 and 4 weeks is what the research really concludes on this, where detraining is enough to unload from the previous accumulation of training, stress built up, but it's not causing long-term loss or damage to performance. So why is this useful? It's really prevent injury, burnout, staleness, and overuse injuries. Even if you're still, doing training loads, heavy training loads into kind of the fall, or let's just say like into the 11th and 12th month of the year, the body can plateau or not adapt to training. So taking a break can help prevent some of that maladaptation from occurring. Also, stress accumulating over time is not just in the body, it's in the mind. So mental stress is unloaded during this time period as well, which can lead to just a breath of fresh air or better motivation for the next round of training that occurs. It also helps the athlete. It gives them the platform to go to another level of performance in the following season. So again, as I said in my intro, is everything builds on itself. We're not talking about a detraining period where you go down to zero, and I'll get into a little bit more of that, but we're talking about a layering approach so that you build into something bigger and better than the year prior. So how do you detrain effectively? Well, first, as I've already said, there's a duration or a time span associated with doing it right and doing it well for a given athlete. 1 week, generally not long enough. It's you've got too much, if you've been training quite a bit, okay, let's just call it, 12 to 20 hour weeks on a regular basis for, 10, 11, 12 months. This is the type of training program where you'll need detraining, and where 1 week easy is not enough to do the detraining that we're talking about. 3 to 4 weeks is more appropriate. And after 4 weeks of doing essentially zero training, you do start to go backward. So, even if it's a total cessation or stopping of training, which could be your detraining phase, by the way, like that's a very appropriate, it's an aggressive resting approach, but it's very appropriate. You're not going to die if you don't train for 4 weeks. Okay. Just be a normal human being. It's fine. We'll talk about a couple different ways to do it, but after 4 weeks, the literature does show that you could be moving backwards in the way of aerobic capacity, reduction of VO2 max, as well as some anaerobic markers. So you don't want to let it go longer than a month. So during this detraining phase, you need to decrease everything: volume, intensity, and frequency. I'm going to give you some big ranges of numbers here, but the common theme is just reduce everything. Okay. These wide range of numbers come from both research and kind of my practice and coaching, but volume, you can decrease it from 60 to 100%, meaning over half to zero training. Okay. Like we talked about, cessation of training. Intensity can decrease by 30 to 100%, meaning you're not doing, any training impulses into the system. And I'll get into time periods of how this can exist. But really the intensity we're talking about is, zone 1 training on a 3-zone system, call it. If you were using, like at CTS, if we're using more of a 6-zone, 7-zone system, we're talking about zone 2 endurance aerobic training. So the predominant intensity is coming from that zone 2 endurance. And then frequency, that should decrease, okay, and just be less than what you were doing before. I think that if you got a couple rest days, if you've been riding, 6 days a week, bringing it down to 4 days a week, over time, that's good. I'll get into a few more examples, but just think less than what you were doing before. So, data. I talk about data. I talk about the richness of data, the importance of data. So, Coach AP, where's the data in this, right? Well, everybody loves CTL. And it's a metric that people like to call fitness. And I've described why that's not accurate. It's adjacent to fitness, but it's a very useful metric in tracking overall stress and accumulated stress, trends of stress over time. And that gives you rich insights into more about the status of the athlete, freshness and and lack of freshness, right? So I'm going to encourage you to, as opposed to a number or an absolute in CTL, I want you to start thinking more about the relative CTL. I think as endurance coaches, physiologists, and athletes, we've done a very good job of putting out absolute CTL numbers as benchmarks in certain sports or categories of what to shoot for certain events. Okay. And That's good. I think it's appropriate to shoot for some of those as high points during the season, or holding a certain CTL in order to accumulate some aerobic goals, but it's not the end all be all, as I've gone over in other episodes on the podcast. But we are actually very terrible about disassociating from these numbers, meaning we put emotion to holding a high CTL, for example, or we put emotion into running a low CTL because we don't want that. Because, again, when it's called fitness, people want a lot of fitness, right? And they identify with a high number and they pride themselves on it. So, in my opinion, it's better to think about CTL always in terms of relative or relativity. We need to think about CTL as high, low, and trends. So high periods, low periods, and what the trend is telling us, or ramp rates. Some people call it, look at that as a ramp rate, ramping up in CTL or ramping down. So once you can wrap your head around more of a relative trend in CTL, meaning the number means nothing, it's all about where my CTL is going, where it was, and what I want it to do, I think that is a more appropriate relationship with CTL. Okay. So then you realize that the number itself is neither good nor bad. It's the goal of what you want out of your fitness. And now as we talk about, because we all know that when we're, say, building fitness, we're in a base to build period. In general, yeah, CTL is going up, right? So in a detraining phase, though, what's the goal? We want CTL to come down. Okay. That's the trend that we want. That's the goal that we want. And say, if we're working with these numbers again, like how much should it come down? Again, it's all relative, right? So it doesn't matter as much as it does come down. And I'll shape some numbers up here and not contradict myself, but I'll give, for those number lovers, I will give you some numbers here in a minute. And then how long should it take for it to come down? Well, it'll start coming down in week 1. Okay. The duration component that we're talking about here, again, 3 to 4 weeks. And so it'll stair step down over time, over that duration. So what about the feelings or the qualitative data that we implement as athletes and we want to read about as coaches? Well, those are feelings, really. How did the workout feel? How did you feel this week, this recovery week? We're still humans. We're not robots. So tune into your body, to know thyself, so to speak, and be honest with yourself. By decreasing your CTL through training, you'll start to feel more fresh. You'll start to feel better. Now, in the short term, your brain and your body will feel a little funky because it's used to carrying such a high load, okay, or a high stress level. But be patient, get through that kind of addiction to train, really, and you'll start to see that the muscles and the heart and your vitality start to come up. That's great. That's what we want. And keep going too, because you'll need to kind of fight some of these cravings to do your training, and you'll look at those numbers and you'll want to pull it back up. But just keep going, because you will feel better. And that's the goal. Tune into yourself. And what we want out of this detraining period is for you to really hit a good reset button. Okay. Total reset, mind and body, so that you can start the next phase of training, the next base or build, whatever's coming next. You can start that 100% fresh with no hindrances from the past year of training. That's the end goal with detraining. Okay, so what about the data, coach? Well, again, I've been having this discussion with several athletes and coaches over the past several weeks, which is a bit of what shaped up some of this podcast, or this episode, I should say. But it's also something that I've been practicing just in my own coaching for some time, right? So as I reviewed how I kind of work it with my athletes, I started to find a few trends. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you what I think works, in my opinion, in my coaching practice, and you can use it. You can shape it, change it for your own needs. But just know that what I'm using is my opinion, and I'm pulling it from some of the latest research. I'm pulling it from using it in the success rate with my athletes and on myself over the years. So what is Coach AP's recipe for detraining? Well, goes back to that duration component, right? 3 weeks dedicated to detraining. In the first week, stay off the bike. Complete no training, no nothing. Okay. And that can be a complete cessation, right, from the bike. And I would encourage everyone to stay off the bike. If you're a cyclist, because it's a great exercise, both mentally and physically, for getting you to wean yourself off. You can walk, you can hike, you can get back into yoga if that's in your practice. You can still do some movement. I'm not saying sit on the couch all week, every week, but just get away from it. Be a normal human being. Okay. Just think differently, be differently. It's okay. Okay. So then week 2 and 3, this is where we come back to the bike, but not as much, right? We want a decreased frequency. We want zone 2, zone 1 rides. And this is also where I'll encourage you to do other things off the bike as well. Walking, hiking, yoga, maybe some strength training if you've been doing it all year round, and you can come back and do some light coordination, activation movements, that type of thing. However, remember, we've reduced volume, we've reduced intensity, and we're still in a reduction of frequency. So if you were, say, riding, 6 days a week before, we're now riding 3 to 4 times a week, and maybe you add some other stuff in. And so maybe you're moving and sweating 5 or 6 days a week, but it's very short. It's to the point. It's not intense. If you're riding 4 to 5 days per week in your normal kind of training habits, try reducing down to 2 or 3 times a week. Go for walks, just keep it light, get fresh air, get some sunshine. We want still good habits of being healthy, but we just want to pull down that training stress, pull down the training load. And you can do that over those next couple weeks. Now, in the 4th week, I will say this one, it can go either way. One, you can continue on as you were with just aerobic rides and just keep on with that reset. But the 4th week, I typically find that for most people who are doing, that, again, 12 to 20 hours a week of training kind of on average, 3 weeks of detraining, as I just described it, that's a pretty good reset. And by the 4th week, we're going to start to ramp back up in a base building mode, meaning still zone 2, but that's where I start to add in more frequency, maybe back to 6 days a week or back to whatever you were doing before, adding in strength training and start to build for the next season. However, that 4th week, if you need more time, take it. Totally fine. I've had athletes, carry this out into 6 weeks. Okay. But they are still doing aerobic stuff. So they're, maintaining, and they are not. My point is don't take 4 weeks completely off where you are just on the couch. You will start to go backwards after that 4th week. Okay. But if you are doing, training sessions 4 or 5 days a week on the bike, you're maintaining. All that stuff's not going to go away. So don't be scared with this. You can run this out for several weeks. But in my, call it recipe, it's typically 3 weeks of pretty good reduction. By the 4th week, start to turn it back up, and then we get back into good habits. What happens with your CTL? It goes down, remember? And kind of a broad range of how far it goes down. It's between 15 and 30%. Okay. What that means is if you're kind of hovering around 100, maybe 110 CTL for the season, that means you'll come down to 70 or 80-ish CTL in about 3 or 4 weeks. You can go lower if you want. That's completely fine. Especially if you're, master's level rider, if you're a weekend warrior, if you're racing crits, racing mountain bikes, that kind of stuff. Here's the goofy part. If you're, racing a full national calendar, or if you're racing some huge gravel races and your CTL, you had 120 plus, right, and really carrying a high load, you can still go down 30%. In fact, the more CTL you had, the more hay in the barn you got. So you can drop that even lower. That's the good news. For those who are a little bit more time crunched if you didn't have such a high CTL, you don't need to drop so low. And in fact, I encourage you not to drop as low. Okay, so maybe 2 weeks of like cessation, and then that third week you bring it back up, and then you fall back into good habits. The reason I say that with a time crunched athlete is because you don't have as much hay in the barn to burn up. Okay, you don't want to let your fitness drop because it'll be harder to get it back up. But for those who are running higher CTLs, you can afford that, and you need it, right? Those who were only training 6 to 8 hours a week on average, you're not as physically stressed as those who are doing 20-hour a week. That's how it works. And don't forget to tune into your mind and body for these signs of increased motivation and desire to start training again in that third and fourth week. Okay. Sure. Look at the numbers. You can use some of these numbers that I gave you to help shape up what you're doing and maybe add a little bit more confidence. But man, tune in your body, because your body knows it's smart. And when you listen to it, things go a lot better. So in summary, the point here is to take time away from harder training and be intentional about it. Detraining is a very appropriate thing to do in endurance training. And in my opinion, it's part of a properly built training program. It's there to help you be successful for where you go next, and it's for your mind and body both. We can use data and metrics to do this, but you don't really need to do it. Don't overthink it. Lean into less. In 3 to 4 weeks of lessness, beginning with just complete stopping of what you're doing, and then get into some light aerobic work after that, that is the recipe for success here. Let your CTL decrease, let your ATL drop, let your TSB go wild. It's totally fine. You'll be more thankful and you'll be more successful in the long run when you come back to training after you've done a proper detraining. You do all that right, you've got the motivation, you've got the energy and the capacity to handle even more than you did in the previous year, and to handle it when it actually matters. So, final words here is lean into some detraining time here this fall, especially if you've had a huge season. You're due for some off-season. This is the first of a few episodes I have centered around this off the bike. What can you do to improve yourself and improve your performance for the upcoming season? So tune in here in the next couple of weeks for that next episode. And that's all for now.